My daughter Maya stood in my living room, her smile bright and reassuring as she held out her hands for my jewelry box. "Mom, I know a wonderful jeweler who specializes in antique restoration," she said. "He'll clean everything, repair the delicate pieces, and have them looking brand new. It'll be my gift to you for your birthday." I handed over the velvet case containing 3 generations of family heirlooms, never imagining that 3 days later, I'd be standing in Hammond's auction house, watching my mother's sapphire necklace going up for sale with a starting bid of $15,000. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have noticed something was wrong the moment Maya suggested taking my jewelry collection for cleaning. My daughter had never shown particular interest in my vintage pieces before, despite knowing their sentimental value. She'd always been more interested in modern, minimalist designs, the kind of sleek contemporary jewelry you'd find in upscale boutiques, rather than estate sales. But there she was, standing in my living room on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, suddenly fascinated by the history and craftsmanship of my grandmother's collection. The morning had started ordinarily enough. I'd been sorting through old photographs in my study, a project I'd been putting off for months, when Maya arrived unannounced. At 42, my daughter was a successful marketing executive with a demanding career and very little free time. Her spontaneous visits had become increasingly rare over the past few years, which made her sudden appearance both surprising and welcome. "Mom, you really should have these pieces professionally maintained," she'd said, examining the jewelry box I kept on my dresser. "Some of these settings look loose, and the gold needs proper cleaning. I'd hate to see you lose a stone because of neglect." Her concern seemed genuine, her voice filled with the kind of caring attention that made me feel like maybe we were finally rebuilding the closeness we'd lost after her father's death 5 years ago. Robert had been gone for half a decade, and the grief had carved a distance between Maya and me that neither of us seemed able to bridge. She'd thrown herself into her career, working longer hours and traveling constantly for business. I'd retreated into my routines, my book club meetings, my volunteer work at the Historical Society. We'd both been surviving rather than living, circling around our loss instead of facing it together. So when Maya showed this sudden interest in something that mattered to me, I wanted desperately to believe it was real. The jewelry box contained pieces that spanned 3 generations of women in my family. My grandmother Eleanor's sapphire and diamond necklace, purchased in Paris in 1947. My mother's pearl earrings, a gift from my father on their 25th anniversary. The ruby bracelet that had belonged to my great-aunt Violet, who'd been a silent film actress in the 1920s. Each piece carried not just monetary value, but stories and memories that connected me to the women who'd worn them before me. "There's a jeweler in the city that Marcus knows," Maya continued, mentioning her husband casually. "He's supposed to be the best for vintage and antique restoration. Very discreet, very professional. He's done work for several of Marcus's clients who collect estate jewelry." Marcus was a financial advisor with wealthy clients, so the recommendation seemed credible. Why would I question my own daughter's suggestion, especially when she was offering to handle everything as a birthday gift? I was turning 68 in 2 weeks, and Maya had seemed distant about the upcoming celebration, changing the subject whenever I mentioned it. Now I understood why. She was planning this thoughtful gesture, taking care of something she knew mattered to me. Or at least, that's what I believed as I carefully packed each piece of jewelry into the velvet-lined box and handed it to her. "I'll have everything back to you in about a week," Maya promised, holding the box against her chest like something precious. "The jeweler needs time to properly assess each piece and determine the best cleaning method for the different metals and stones. Some of these are quite delicate and require specialized care." She spoke with an authority that I found reassuring, as if she'd done extensive research on antique jewelry restoration just for this purpose. After she left, I felt a warmth in my chest that had been absent for too long. My daughter was thinking about me, caring about the things that connected us to our family history. Maybe Robert's death had finally finished processing in her heart, and she was ready to rebuild our relationship. I spent the rest of the afternoon imagining her birthday party, thinking about how meaningful it would be to wear my freshly restored jewelry and know that Maya had made it possible. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later on Friday afternoon. I was having lunch with my friend Patricia at our usual cafe downtown, when she mentioned that her daughter-in-law had dragged her to an estate jewelry auction preview the previous evening. Horrible experience, Patricia said, wrinkling her nose. 3 hours of looking at dead people's jewelry, while Amanda pretended to know the difference between Art Deco and Art Nouveau. But there was one stunning sapphire necklace that reminded me of that piece your grandmother left you. Same era, same style. Made me think of you. Something cold settled in my stomach. What auction house? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Patricia looked at me curiously. Hammond's, that place on Westfield Avenue. Why? Are you thinking of selling your grandmother's necklace? Vivian, you shouldn't. That piece has been in your family for decades. I made some excuse about just being curious and changed the subject, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Sapphire necklaces from the 1940s weren't exactly rare. The similarity Patricia noticed was just coincidence. But the feeling wouldn't go away, persistent and uncomfortable, like a stone in my shoe. That evening, I did something I would have considered paranoid and invasive just days earlier. I looked up Hammond's auction house online and found their upcoming estate jewelry auction scheduled for the following Wednesday. The preview gallery was available on their website, showing photographs of each lot that would be up for bid. I scrolled through page after page of rings, bracelets, and necklaces, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I wouldn't find anything familiar. Then I saw it. Lot number 47. My grandmother's sapphire necklace photographed against black velvet, the distinctive platinum filigree setting unmistakable. The central sapphire, a rare cornflower blue stone of exceptional clarity, surrounded by small diamonds in a design that had been custom-made in Paris specifically for Eleanor. There was even a tiny maker's mark on the clasp that I'd examined countless times, the signature of the French jeweler who'd created it. This wasn't a similar piece. This was my necklace. I clicked through to the detailed description. Exquisite 1947 Parisian sapphire and diamond necklace, platinum setting, estimated value $25,000 to $35,000. Provenance: private collection, consigned for estate settlement. Estate settlement. As if the owner had died and their heirs were liquidating assets. But I wasn't dead, and I certainly hadn't consigned anything to any auction house. My hand shook as I continued scrolling through the auction lots. Lot 51 was my mother's pearl earrings, described as vintage cultured pearl drops with 18-karat gold settings, circa 1965. Lot 63 was Aunt Violet's ruby bracelet, catalogued as Art Deco ruby and platinum bracelet, exceptional craftsmanship, 1922. Every significant piece from my jewelry box was there, photographed and catalogued and scheduled to be sold in 5 days to the highest bidder. I sat at my computer desk in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maya had my jewelry. Maya had taken my jewelry to a jeweler for cleaning. But somehow my jewelry had ended up at an auction house instead, listed under estate settlement, as if I was already gone. The logical connections my brain was trying to make seemed impossible, too monstrous to accept. My daughter wouldn't steal from me. She couldn't be planning to sell family heirlooms that she knew meant everything to me. There had to be some explanation, some terrible mistake that would make sense once Maya explained it. I picked up my phone and called her number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Maya, it's Mom. I need to talk to you about the jewelry. Please call me back as soon as you get this. It's important. I tried to keep my voice steady, not wanting to sound accusatory, still clinging to the possibility that this was all some bizarre misunderstanding. She didn't call back that evening. Or the next morning. By Saturday afternoon, I'd left 3 more messages, each one slightly more urgent than the last. Maya had always been responsive to my calls even during her busiest work weeks. Her sudden silence felt deliberate, calculated, like she was avoiding me because she knew exactly why I was calling. Sunday morning, I drove to Maya's house in the suburbs, a beautiful colonial-style home in an expensive neighborhood that I'd always thought was slightly beyond what she and Marcus could comfortably afford. Maya's car was in the driveway, but no one answered when I rang the doorbell. I could see movement behind the curtains in the upstairs bedroom window, the shadow of someone stepping back from view. They were home. They just didn't want to face me. I stood on my daughter's front porch, my hand raised to ring the bell again, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. For 5 years, I'd made excuses for Maya's distance, her preoccupation, her increasingly infrequent visits. I'd blamed grief, blamed her demanding career, blamed anything except the obvious truth that she'd been pulling away from me deliberately. And now she'd stolen from me, taking the one thing that connected me most tangibly to my mother and grandmother, and she couldn't even face me to explain why. The anger that surged through me was cleaner and sharper than anything I'd felt in years. Not the muddy, complicated grief of losing Robert, but pure righteous fury at being betrayed by the person I'd loved and trusted most in the world. My daughter had looked me in the eye, smiled her bright reassuring smile, and lied to me while taking irreplaceable pieces of my family history to sell for money. I left Maya's porch and drove directly to Hammond's auction house. The building was closed on Sundays, but I sat in the parking lot and called the main number.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Leaving a detailed message for the auction house manager, I explained that several pieces in their upcoming estate jewelry auction belonged to me, that they'd been taken without my permission, and that I needed to speak with someone immediately about stopping the sale. Monday morning I received a call from Gerald Hammond himself, the owner of the auction house. His voice was professionally sympathetic but cautious. "Mrs. Fairchild, I understand your concern, but the items in question were consigned to us through proper legal channels. We have documentation of ownership transfer and authorization to sell. I'm afraid without evidence of theft or fraud, we can't simply remove items from our scheduled auction." "What documentation?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Those pieces belong to me. They've been in my family for generations. I never authorized any sale or ownership transfer." Gerald Hammond sighed, the sound of a man who'd dealt with family disputes over estate jewelry before. "The consignment came through an estate attorney representing a client who wished to liquidate assets. We verified the documentation thoroughly, Mrs. Fairchild. I can assure you that everything appeared legitimate." "Which estate attorney?" He hesitated. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information without proper legal authorization. If you believe there's been a crime committed, I'd suggest you contact the police and have them investigate. If they determine the items were obtained illegally, we'll certainly cooperate with removing them from auction." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my grandmother's photograph on the wall. Eleanor looked back at me with the same determined expression I remembered from childhood, the look of a woman who didn't accept defeat easily. She'd survived the Depression, raised 4 children while my grandfather built his medical practice, and maintained her dignity and strength through decades of challenges I could only imagine. What would she do if she were in my position? She'd fight back. She wouldn't sit passively while someone stole from her family, and she certainly wouldn't let a betrayal like this go unanswered. I picked up my phone and called the police non-emergency number to file a theft report. The officer who took my information was polite, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice when I explained that my daughter had taken the jewelry. "Family disputes over property can be complicated, ma'am. Are you sure your daughter didn't have permission to take these items? Sometimes these misunderstandings happen when family members have different recollections of what was agreed to." "I have not agreed to anything," I said firmly. "My daughter told me she was taking my jewelry to be cleaned and restored as a birthday gift. Instead, she's put everything up for auction without my knowledge or consent. That's theft." The officer took down the details and promised to send someone to take a formal statement, but I could tell from his tone that he didn't consider this a priority case. Family drama over jewelry probably ranked pretty low on the police department's list of urgent matters. Tuesday afternoon, a young police officer named Davis came to my house to take my statement. He was thorough and professional, photographing my jewelry box and the empty spaces where my pieces had been stored, documenting the text messages and voicemail messages I'd left for Maya, reviewing the auction house listings that showed my jewelry scheduled for sale. But when he finished, he delivered news I didn't want to hear. "Mrs. Fairchild, legally this is a complicated situation. Your daughter had access to your home and your jewelry with your permission. You voluntarily gave her the items in question. Without evidence that she intended to steal from you at the time you handed over the jewelry, this becomes a civil matter rather than a criminal one. I'll file the report, but I have to be honest with you. The district attorney's office is unlikely to pursue charges in a case like this. So she can just steal from me, and there's nothing anyone will do about it? Officer Davis looked uncomfortable. You can pursue this through civil court. Sue for the return of your property or for damages. But criminal theft charges require proving intent, and when you voluntarily gave someone the items, that becomes very difficult to establish. After he left, I sat alone in my house feeling more helpless than I had since Robert's death. The police wouldn't help. The auction house wouldn't help. Maya wouldn't even answer my phone calls. In 3 days, my family's jewelry would be sold to strangers, scattered to collectors across the country, and there was apparently nothing I could do to stop it. That's when I remembered Charlotte Chen, the attorney who'd handled Robert's estate after he died. Charlotte was sharp, aggressive when necessary, and she'd been genuinely kind during one of the worst periods of my life. If anyone could help me figure out how to fight this, it would be her. I called her office and was relieved when her secretary told me she had a cancellation the next morning and could see me at 9 o'clock. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about my grandmother Eleanor, who'd worn that sapphire necklace to every significant event in her adult life. She'd worn it to my mother's wedding, to my own wedding, to Robert's funeral. The necklace had touched my skin on my wedding day when Eleanor fastened it around my neck and told me that the women in our family were stronger than we looked, that we survived things that would break other people. She'd been right about that strength, even if she couldn't have imagined I'd need it to fight my own daughter. Wednesday morning, I arrived at Charlotte Chen's office 15 minutes early, clutching a folder containing printouts of the auction listings, copies of my text messages to Maya, and photographs of my jewelry that I'd taken years ago for insurance purposes. Charlotte greeted me with the same warm professionalism I remembered, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence behind stylish glasses. I laid out everything that had happened, from Maya's unexpected visit to the auction house discovery to the police officer's discouraging assessment. Charlotte listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on her legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me thoughtfully. Vivian, I'm going to ask you something that might sound harsh, but I need you to really think about your answer. Is it possible that Maya believed she had some legitimate claim to this jewelry? Had you ever discussed leaving it to her in your will? Or mentioned that you wanted her to have it eventually? I shook my head firmly. Never. Maya leaves everything to Maya because she's my only child, but I've never suggested she should have access to anything before my death. And certainly never implied she could sell family heirlooms for cash. Charlotte tapped her pen against her pad. The police officer was right about one thing. Criminal charges will be nearly impossible to pursue given that you voluntarily handed over the property. But civil litigation is definitely an option. We can file an emergency injunction to stop the auction, then pursue a lawsuit for the return of your property. However, I need to warn you that litigation against a family member, especially your only child, can be emotionally devastating and may permanently damage your relationship. Charlotte, she stole from me. She's selling my grandmother's jewelry at auction. I don't think there's a relationship left to damage. Charlotte nodded slowly. Then we fight. And I'll warn you now, Vivian, if Maya is desperate enough to steal from her own mother, she's probably desperate enough to fight very dirty to keep from getting caught. Are you prepared for what that might mean? I thought about Eleanor's determined expression in that photograph, about the strength she'd promised was in our family's blood. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. What I didn't know then was just how dirty the fight would become, or how many more betrayals I'd discover before it was over. But I was about to find out. Charlotte moved fast. By noon that same day, she'd filed an emergency motion with the county court seeking a temporary restraining order to prevent Hammond's auction house from selling any of the disputed items. By 3 o'clock, we had a hearing scheduled for the next morning. By 5 o'clock, Maya finally called me back. Mom, what are you doing? Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. I just got served with legal papers. You're suing me? Over a misunderstanding. The sheer audacity of calling it a misunderstanding took my breath away. Maya, you stole my jewelry and put it up for auction. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft. I didn't steal anything, she snapped. That jewelry is part of my inheritance. You've always said everything would come to me eventually. I just needed access to it now. Marcus and I are going through a difficult financial period, and I thought you'd understand if I explained it properly. So you didn't explain it at all? You lied to me and took things that don't belong to you. There was a long pause. When Maya spoke again, her voice had shifted to something I'd never heard from her before. Something cold and calculating. Mom, I really think you should drop this lawsuit. You're not thinking clearly. You've been having some memory issues lately, and I'm worried that you're not competent to be making these kinds of decisions. Maybe we need to talk about getting you some help. The words hit me like ice water. Memory issues. Not competent. The same language I'd heard stories about. The way families justify taking control of elderly relatives' assets by claiming they're no longer capable of managing their own affairs. Maya was threatening me, warning me that if I didn't back down, she'd try to have me declared incompetent. My memory is perfect, Maya, and my thinking has never been clearer. I'll see you in court tomorrow. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. My daughter was willing to destroy me to cover up her theft. The woman I'd raised, the child I'd loved and nurtured and sacrificed for, was prepared to paint me as a confused old woman losing her grip on reality rather than admit what she'd done. That evening, Charlotte called with an update. The auction house has agreed not to sell the disputed items pending the court's ruling. That's good news. But Vivian, I need to tell you something concerning. Maya's attorney filed a countermotion this afternoon. They're claiming that you have diminished capacity, and that Maya has been managing your affairs with your consent, because you're no longer able to do so effectively. That's a complete lie. I know, but they're going to try to make it believable. Do you have a regular doctor? Someone who can testify to your mental competence. I thought about Dr. Saunders, my physician for the past 12 years. I'd had my annual checkup just 6 weeks ago, and he pronounced me remarkably healthy for my age. Yes, I'll contact him first thing in the morning. After we hung up, I sat in my dark living room and realized that Maya had been planning this for longer than just a few days. The sudden interest in my jewelry, the concern about proper maintenance, the offer to handle everything as a birthday gift. It had all been carefully calculated to get me to voluntarily hand over valuable property that she could then sell. And the backup plan, claiming I was incompetent if I discovered what she'd done, suggested a level of premeditation that made my blood run cold. How long had my daughter been planning to betray me? And more importantly, what had gone so wrong in her life that stealing from her own mother seemed like an acceptable solution? The courthouse hallway smelled like floor polish and anxiety. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, my hands folded in my lap, trying to project a calm confidence I didn't entirely feel. Charlotte sat beside me, reviewing her notes one final time, occasionally glancing at her watch. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and it was now 9:45. At 9:50, Maya arrived with her attorney, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Leonard Breslin. Maya wouldn't meet my eyes. She looked polished and professional in a navy blue dress and pearls, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like a successful executive, a responsible adult daughter concerned about her aging mother's welfare. It was a perfect costume for the role she was about to play. Mrs. Fairchild, Leonard Breslin said, his voice smooth and practiced, I hope we can resolve this matter without unnecessary conflict. Family disputes are always unfortunate, especially when they stem from misunderstandings about estate planning and asset management. Charlotte stood up, positioning herself slightly in front of me. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Breslin. Your client took property that doesn't belong to her, and attempted to sell it without authorization. That's called theft, regardless of family relationships. Breslin smiled thinly. I think you'll find the situation is considerably more nuanced than that. Before Charlotte could respond, a bailiff emerged from the courtroom and called our case. We filed inside, taking our positions at opposite tables in front of Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of human foolishness and wasn't easily impressed by any of it. Judge Morrison reviewed the filings quickly, her eyes moving across the pages with practiced efficiency. When she looked up, her gaze moved between Maya and me with sharp assessment. This is a motion for emergency injunction to prevent the sale of certain jewelry items currently held by Hammond's auction house. Ms. Chun, you're representing the plaintiff. Charlotte stood. Yes, Your Honor. My client Vivian Fairchild is seeking to prevent the sale of family heirlooms that were taken from her under false pretenses by her daughter, the defendant Maya Whitmore. These items have significant monetary value, estimated at over $100,000 total, but more importantly, they have irreplaceable sentimental value as they've been in Mrs. Fairchild's family for 3 generations. Mr. Breslin, you're opposing this motion? Judge Morrison looked at Maya's attorney. We are, Your Honor. Our position is that Mrs. Fairchild voluntarily gave these items to her daughter with the understanding that Mrs. Whitmore would manage their sale as part of a broader arrangement where Mrs. Whitmore has been assisting her mother with financial and estate planning decisions due to Mrs. Fairchild's declining cognitive function. The words declining cognitive function hung in the air like poison. I felt Charlotte tense beside me, but her voice remained steady and professional. Your Honor, that allegation is completely unfounded. Mrs. Fairchild is a competent, intelligent woman who has no cognitive impairment whatsoever. This is a transparent attempt to justify theft by claiming the victim is incompetent to recognize what was done to her. Judge Morrison raised a hand for silence. Let's proceed methodically. Ms. Chun, can you establish the basic facts of what occurred? Charlotte walked me through the timeline. Maya's unexpected visit, her offer to have my jewelry cleaned and restored as a birthday gift, my voluntary transfer of the items to her, the discovery of the jewelry listed at auction 3 days later, Maya's subsequent refusal to return my property or explain her actions. And Mrs. Fairchild, Judge Morrison addressed me directly. When you gave these items to your daughter, did you understand that she intended to sell them? I stood, my voice clear and firm. Absolutely not, Your Honor. She explicitly told me she was taking them to a jeweler for cleaning and restoration. She said it would be her birthday gift to me. I had no idea she planned to sell them until I discovered them listed at Hammond's auction house. Judge Morrison made a note. Mr. Breslin, your turn. Leonard Breslin stood and approached the bench with the confidence of a man who believed he had the winning hand. Your Honor, while Mrs. Fairchild's recollection of events may seem clear to her, we have evidence that suggests her memory and judgment have been increasingly unreliable over the past several months. Her daughter has been deeply concerned about these changes and has been quietly managing certain aspects of her mother's affairs to protect her from making poor financial decisions. What evidence? Charlotte's voice was sharp. Breslin pulled several documents from his folder. We have statements from Mrs. Whitmore documenting instances where her mother has exhibited confusion, memory lapses, and poor judgment. On 3 separate occasions in the past 2 months, Mrs. Fairchild has called her daughter in the middle of the night, disoriented and unable to remember where she was. On one occasion, she left her stove on for several hours, creating a fire hazard. On another, she forgot a scheduled medical appointment that she'd written in her calendar. Each word he spoke was a carefully constructed lie, and I felt rage building in my chest. I'd never called Maya in the middle of the night. I'd never left my stove on. I'd never missed a medical appointment. But Breslin was delivering these fabrications with such smooth confidence that they sounded plausible, painting a picture of a confused elderly woman slowly losing her grip on reality. Furthermore, Breslin continued, Mrs. Whitmore has been in regular communication with her mother's physician, Dr. Saunders, expressing concerns about these changes in cognitive function. She's been attempting to arrange for a comprehensive neurological evaluation, but her mother has been resistant, which is itself a common symptom in patients experiencing early dementia. They often lack insight into their own decline. Charlotte was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, this is pure fiction. Mrs. Fairchild saw Dr. Saunders 6 weeks ago for her annual physical. He found her to be in excellent health, both physically and mentally. If Mr. Breslin has evidence to the contrary, I'd like to see it. Breslin produced another document. This is a letter from Dr. Saunders acknowledging Mrs. Whitmore's concerns about her mother's cognitive changes and recommending further evaluation by a specialist. The world seemed to tilt around me. Dr. Saunders had written a letter expressing concerns about my cognitive function? The man who told me at my last appointment that I was healthier than most people 20 years younger? Charlotte took the document and studied it, her expression growing darker. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to contact Dr. Saunders directly and verify the authenticity of this letter. Judge Morrison checked her watch. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Use it wisely, Miss Chun. In the hallway, Charlotte was already on her phone, her voice clipped and urgent as she spoke to Dr. Saunders' office. I sank onto the bench, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. Maya had somehow gotten Dr. Saunders to write a letter questioning my mental competence. How was that even possible? 10 minutes later, Charlotte returned with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dr. Saunders is on his way to the courthouse. He says he never wrote that letter, and he's extremely disturbed that someone forged his signature on a document making medical claims he never authorized. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I felt dizzy. So it's fake? Maya forged a doctor's letter. It appears that way, which is going to make Mr. Breslin's position significantly more difficult. When we returned to the courtroom, Charlotte immediately addressed Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I've been in contact with Dr. Saunders, Mrs. Fairchild's physician. He informs me that the letter submitted by opposing counsel is fraudulent. He never wrote such a letter, never expressed such concerns, and is on his way here now to testify to that fact. I move to have the document stricken from the record and request that the court consider sanctions against Mr. Breslin for submitting fraudulent evidence. Leonard Breslin's face had gone pale. Your Honor, I received that document from my client. I had no reason to believe it wasn't authentic. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from neutral professionalism to active displeasure. Mr. Breslin, are you telling this court that your client provided you with a forged medical document? I'm saying that I received the document in good faith from Mrs. Whitmore, who may have been mistaken about its origin. It was a desperate attempt to distance himself from Maya's fraud, throwing his own client under the bus to protect himself from sanctions. Judge Morrison turned her sharp gaze on Maya. Mrs. Whitmore, where did you obtain this letter purportedly from Dr. Saunders? Maya stood slowly, her face flushed. Your Honor, I may have misunderstood. I had a phone conversation with Dr. Saunders' office about my concerns regarding my mother, and I thought they were going to send me documentation of that conversation. Perhaps I received something from a different source and confused it with the doctor's response. It was a terrible lie, transparent and desperate, and I could see Judge Morrison wasn't buying it for a second. So this document came from an unknown source, but you presented it to your attorney as legitimate medical evidence? Before Maya could answer, the courtroom doors opened and Dr. Saunders entered, slightly out of breath from hurrying. He was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the calm authority that came from decades of medical practice. Charlotte quickly brought him up to speed and showed him the forged letter. His face darkened as he read it. This is absolutely not from me. The signature is a reasonable forgery, but the content is complete fiction. I have never had any concerns about Mrs. Fairchild's cognitive function. She's one of my healthiest patients both mentally and physically. I would never write such a letter, and I certainly never authorized anyone to create one in my name. Judge Morrison's expression had moved past displeasure into something closer to anger. Dr. Saunders, in your medical opinion, does Mrs. Fairchild show any signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity? Dr. Saunders looked directly at me with professional warmth. None whatsoever. Vivian is sharp, articulate, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. I would testify to that under oath without any hesitation. The judge turned back to Maya and her attorney. Mr. Breslin, it appears your entire case rests on fraudulent evidence and false allegations about Mrs. Fairchild's mental competence. Do you have any legitimate evidence to present, or shall we proceed to ruling on the emergency injunction? Leonard Breslin looked like a man watching his career prospects evaporate. Your Honor, I request permission to withdraw from representing Mrs. Whitmore. I was clearly misled about the facts of this case. Judge Morrison's voice was ice. Motion denied, Mr. Breslin. You brought these allegations into my courtroom, and you'll see this hearing through. Now, do you have any actual evidence that Mrs. Fairchild consented to the sale of her jewelry, or that she lacks the capacity to manage her own property? Breslin shuffled through his remaining documents with visible desperation. We have Mrs. Whitmore's testimony that her mother has been discussing liquidating assets, and that she volunteered to help facilitate that process. Charlotte stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Fairchild is here and fully capable of testifying about her own intentions. I'd ask that she be allowed to address the court directly. Judge Morrison nodded. Mrs. Fairchild, please approach. I stood and moved to the witness stand, feeling steadier than I had all morning. The forged letter had been Maya's biggest weapon, and Dr. Saunders had demolished it completely. Now it was just my word against my daughter's, and I had truth on my side. Charlotte guided me through my testimony. I explained the history of the jewelry, the sentimental value of each piece, Maya's specific statements about cleaning and restoration, and my absolute shock at discovering the items listed for auction. I described my attempts to contact Maya after the discovery, her refusal to return my calls, and her eventual threat that she'd claim I was incompetent if I pursued legal action. Mrs. Fairchild, Charlotte asked, at any point did you give your daughter permission to sell your jewelry? My voice was clear and firm. Never. I would never consent to selling family heirlooms that have been passed down through 3 generations. Those pieces connect me to my mother and grandmother. They're irreplaceable. And have you ever exhibited the cognitive symptoms that Mr. Breslin described? The confusion, the memory lapses, the disorientation. I looked directly at Judge Morrison. No, Your Honor. I have never called my daughter in the middle of the night confused about where I was. I have never left my stove on and created a fire hazard. I have never missed medical appointments. Every single one of those allegations is a complete fabrication designed to make me seem incompetent, so that Maya could justify stealing from me. When it was Breslin's turn to cross-examine me, he seemed to have lost all his earlier confidence. His questions were half-hearted, easily deflected. He tried to suggest that perhaps I'd forgotten giving Maya permission to sell the jewelry, but Dr. Saunders' testimony had already established that my memory was excellent. He tried to imply that family dynamics were complicated and perhaps there had been miscommunication, but I calmly repeated that there was no miscommunication about theft. Finally, Judge Morrison had heard enough. I'm prepared to rule on the emergency injunction. Mr. Breslin, does your client wish to testify? Maya and her attorney had a whispered conference. After a moment, Breslin stood. Mrs. Whitmore declines to testify at this time, Your Honor. Judge Morrison's expression made it clear what she thought of that decision. Very well. Based on the evidence presented, I'm granting the emergency injunction. Hammond's auction house is hereby prohibited from selling any of the jewelry items in question. Those items are to be returned immediately to Mrs. Fairchild's possession. She paused, her gaze settling on Maya with visible disdain. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the apparent fraud perpetrated in this case. The submission of forged medical documents is a serious matter. I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges related to fraud and forgery. Maya's face had gone white. Breslin started to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off. Mr. Breslin, your client came into my courtroom and presented fraudulent evidence in an attempt to strip her own mother of her property and her autonomy. That's not just civil misconduct. That's potentially criminal behavior. The district attorney will determine whether charges are warranted. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like justice. This hearing is adjourned. Mrs. Fairchild, you'll have your jewelry back within 24 hours. Ms. Chun, please coordinate with Hammond's auction house for the return of the items. As we left the courtroom, I felt simultaneously triumphant and devastated. I'd won. My jewelry would be returned. Maya's lies had been exposed in open court. But I'd also just watched my only daughter commit fraud in a desperate attempt to steal from me. And I still didn't understand why. In the courthouse hallway, Maya finally looked at me directly for the first time that day. Her eyes were red, her carefully composed expression crumbling. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to go this far. I just needed the money so badly, and I thought you wouldn't notice for a while, and by the time you did, I could explain everything and maybe you'd understand. Understand what, Maya? Understand why you stole from me? Understand why you forged a doctor's letter to make me seem incompetent? What possible explanation could make any of that acceptable? She started crying, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Marcus and I are drowning in debt. The business failed. We're about to lose the house. I didn't know what else to do. Leonard Breslin put a hand on her arm, warning her to stop talking, but she shook him off. I just needed enough to get us through this rough patch. I was going to tell you eventually. I was going to pay you back. I never meant for it to become this huge thing. Charlotte stepped between us, her voice professional but cold. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd advise you to stop speaking immediately. Anything you say right now can, and will be used against you if the district attorney decides to prosecute. Maya looked at me with desperate eyes. Mom, please. Don't let them press charges. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm still your daughter. Please. I stared at the woman I'd raised, the child I'd loved unconditionally for 42 years, and tried to find some remnant of that connection. But all I could see was someone who'd been willing to destroy me to solve her own problems. Someone who'd forged documents, created elaborate lies, and would have had me declared incompetent if it meant accessing my money. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided stealing from me was an acceptable solution to your financial problems, I said quietly. I don't know who you are anymore, Maya. But you're not the person I raised. I turned and walked away, leaving her crying in the courthouse hallway. Charlotte fell into step beside me, her heels clicking efficiently on the marble floor. That was incredibly difficult, Vivian. I'm proud of you. I don't feel proud. I feel gutted. Outside, the autumn sun was bright and warm, completely at odds with the darkness of what had just happened. Charlotte paused on the courthouse steps. The district attorney's office will be in touch. They'll want your cooperation if they decide to prosecute. But Vivian, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that they might not pursue charges. Fraud cases involving family members are complicated, and prosecutors often decline them unless the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. She forged a doctor's letter. Charlotte nodded. But she's also your daughter, and juries are sympathetic to family members in financial distress. The DA might decide it's not worth the resources, especially if Maya agrees to return the jewelry and make restitution. The thought of Maya facing no consequences beyond the return of property she should never have taken made my stomach turn. So she might get away with this? Charlotte's expression was sympathetic. Civil court is often more effective than criminal court for cases like this. We can pursue a lawsuit for damages, emotional distress, the cost of legal fees. We can make sure she understands there are consequences for what she did. Over the next 2 days, I learned just how deep Maya's deception had gone. Charlotte hired a private investigator named Dennis Walters, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. What Dennis uncovered was far worse than a daughter desperate to save her failing marriage and business. Maya and Marcus weren't just in financial trouble. They were drowning in gambling debts. Marcus had a serious addiction to online poker and sports betting that he'd been hiding for years. They'd mortgaged their house twice, maxed out every credit card, borrowed from Marcus's business partners. They owed money to online gambling sites, to loan sharks, to people who made their living collecting debts through methods that weren't exactly legal. The jewelry I'd handed over so trustingly represented a lifeline to them. $100,000 in antique pieces that could be quickly liquidated at auction. It would have paid off their most pressing debts, bought them time to figure out their next move. And when I discovered the theft and threatened to take legal action, Maya had panicked and escalated to fraud. But here's what made everything infinitely worse. This wasn't Maya's first attempt to steal from me. Dennis discovered that Maya had been slowly siphoning money from my accounts for the past 8 months. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there that I'd attributed to my own spending. But over time the amounts had grown larger. She'd stolen nearly $30,000 before deciding that wasn't enough, and going after my jewelry. How had she accessed my accounts? Through online banking credentials I'd foolishly shared with her 2 years ago, when I'd been recovering from minor surgery and needed help managing my bills. I'd never changed the passwords after I recovered. I trusted my daughter completely, and she'd spent the past 8 months betraying that trust systematically and methodically. Charlotte presented all of this evidence to the district attorney's office, along with copies of my bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, communication records between Maya and Marcus discussing my jewelry and how much they could get for it, and the forged medical letter that had been submitted to the court. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, I received a call from Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Torres. Her voice was professional but warm. Mrs. Fairchild, I wanted to update you on the status of the investigation into your daughter's actions. We've completed our review of the evidence, and we've decided to pursue criminal charges. Relief flooded through me so intensely I had to sit down. What charges? Rebecca explained. We're charging Mrs. Whitmore with multiple counts of theft, 1 count of forgery for the fake medical letter, and 1 count of attempted fraud. If convicted on all counts, she's looking at potential prison time, though more likely she'll be offered a plea deal that includes restitution, probation, and community service. Prison time. My daughter facing prison time. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been the one to set this entire process in motion. Mrs. Fairchild, I need to ask you something important, Rebecca continued. Are you prepared to testify against your daughter if this goes to trial? Because once we file these charges, there's no going back. Your daughter's attorney will almost certainly try to negotiate a plea deal, but if they don't, you'll need to take the stand and tell your story in open court. I thought about Eleanor's photograph, about the strength she'd promised was in our blood. I thought about all the other families where elderly parents were being victimized by their own children, stripped of their assets and their autonomy by people who were supposed to love and protect them. If I back down now, if I let Maya escape consequences because she was my daughter, what message did that send? Yes, I said firmly. I'm prepared to testify. My daughter needs to face consequences for what she did, not just to me, but as a lesson to anyone else who thinks stealing from elderly family members is an acceptable solution to their problems. Rebecca's approval was evident in her voice. Good. We need more people like you, Mrs. Fairchild. Too many victims decline to press charges against family members, which just enables more abuse. You're doing the right thing. After we hung up, I sat in my living room and cried for the first time since this nightmare began. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of release. The hardest decision had been made. Maya would face justice whether she was my daughter or not. The next day, Maya was arrested at her home. I learned about it from Charlotte, who called to inform me that Maya had been booked, processed, and released on bail. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week. How did she seem? I asked, hating myself for caring but unable to stop. Charlotte's voice was carefully neutral. According to the prosecutor's office, she was devastated. She apparently asked multiple times if you could be contacted, if there was any way to speak with you before the arraignment. They told her that all communication needs to go through attorneys now. Maya wanted to talk to me. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, to understand how she justified her actions to herself. But a larger part knew that talking to her would only make everything harder. She'd had weeks to explain herself, to tell me the truth, to show remorse. Instead, she doubled down on lies and fraud. Whatever she wanted to say now was too little, too late. The morning of Maya's arraignment, I sat in the public gallery with Charlotte beside me. I watched my daughter stand before a judge and hear the charges read against her. Multiple counts of theft, forgery, attempted fraud. Each charge represented a betrayal, a choice she'd made to prioritize her own desperate needs over my well-being. Maya pleaded not guilty, which meant this wasn't over. There would be a trial or more likely long negotiations toward a plea agreement. Months of legal proceedings ahead, each one forcing me to relive the discovery of her betrayal. But I was prepared for that. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and about making sure Maya understood that actions have consequences, even when those actions target family members. As I left the courthouse that day, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. For 42 years, being Maya's mother had been central to my identity. But she'd broken that bond irreparably when she'd chosen to see me as a source of money rather than as a person deserving of love and respect. I would always be her mother in a biological sense, but the relationship we'd had, the trust and affection and mutual care was gone. She destroyed it herself. What remained was the woman I'd been before Maya was born. Vivian Fairchild, Eleanor's granddaughter, possessing the same strength and determination that had carried 3 generations of women through wars and depressions and personal tragedies. That woman was still here, still capable of rebuilding a life around something other than motherhood. The jewelry was returned to me exactly as promised, each piece carefully packaged and documented. I opened the box in my living room with Charlotte present as a witness, touching each familiar item with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The sapphire necklace that Eleanor had worn at my wedding. The pearl earrings my mother had treasured. Aunt Violet's ruby bracelet that had adorned a silent film star's wrist nearly a century ago. They were back where they belonged, but holding them felt different now. They were no longer just beautiful objects connecting me to my family's past. They were evidence of my daughter's betrayal, reminders of how completely I'd misjudged the person I thought I knew best in the world. The innocence with which I'd handed them over to Maya, trusting her completely, seemed like something from another lifetime. That evening, I did something I'd been considering since the courthouse hearing. I called my attorney and asked her to draft a new will. The old will left everything to Maya because she was my only child, and despite everything that had happened, that hadn't changed. But Charlotte suggested adding specific conditions and protections. You could set up a trust, she explained. Leave your assets in trust with specific instructions for how they can be used. You could require that Maya complete a financial counseling program before accessing any inheritance. You could stipulate that certain items, like your jewelry, can never be sold and must be passed down to future generations. You have options that don't completely disinherit her, but do protect your legacy from being liquidated to pay gambling debts. The idea of my grandmother's sapphire necklace ending up in a pawn shop to cover Marcus's poker losses made me physically ill. Charlotte was right. I needed to protect these pieces for future generations, even if that meant my own daughter couldn't be trusted with them. Let's do it, I said. Create the trust. Put whatever restrictions necessary to ensure these family heirlooms remain in the family and are never sold. As Charlotte worked on the new estate documents, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. If Maya could betray me this thoroughly, how many other adult children were doing the same thing to their aging parents? How many elderly people were being systematically drained of their life savings by family members who knew exactly how to exploit their trust and access? I started researching elder financial abuse, and what I discovered was staggering. Billions of dollars stolen every year from older adults, most often by their own family members. Adult children with access to bank accounts. Grandchildren who borrowed money with no intention of paying it back. Caregivers who helped themselves to jewelry and valuables. The statistics were horrifying, and the victims often remained silent out of shame or misplaced family loyalty. 3 months after Maya's arrest, her attorney reached out to Charlotte with a plea deal offer. Maya would plead guilty to reduce charges, pay full restitution for the stolen money and legal fees, complete a financial crimes education program, and serve 2 years of supervised probation. In exchange, she'd avoid prison time and have the opportunity to have her record cleared after successfully completing probation. Charlotte presented the offer to me objectively. It's a reasonable deal. She'll have a criminal record, she'll have to pay back everything she took, and she'll be under court supervision for 2 years. It's significant consequences without destroying her life completely. But Vivian, the decision is entirely yours. If you want to push for a trial and potentially harsher penalties, we can do that. I thought about it for a long time. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Some assurance that Maya had learned her lesson? The truth was that no punishment would undo what she'd done or restore the relationship we'd lost. Prison time wouldn't give me back the daughter I thought I had, because that person had apparently never existed. I'll agree to the plea deal, I finally told Charlotte. On 2 conditions. First, Maya has to complete not just a financial crimes program, but also mandatory therapy to address whatever issues led her to think stealing from her mother was acceptable. And second, she has to provide a complete accounting of everywhere my money went. I want to know exactly how she spent $30,000 of my savings. Charlotte made those conditions part of the agreement, and Maya's attorney accepted. The plea hearing was scheduled for late January. I attended, sitting in the same public gallery where I'd watched her arraignment months earlier. This time, Maya pleaded guilty to theft and forgery, accepting responsibility for her actions in a voice that shook with emotion. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the agreed-upon sentence. 2 years probation, full restitution, mandatory counseling and financial education programs, and community service at an organization that worked with elderly abuse victims. That last requirement had been Rebecca Torres's idea. Make her see the faces of the people harmed by crimes like hers. Make her understand the real human cost of what she did. After the hearing, Maya tried to approach me in the hallway. Her attorney stopped her, reminding her that part of the probation terms included no contact with me unless I initiated it. Maya stood 10 feet away, tears streaming down her face, mouthing the words, "I'm sorry." I looked at her for a long moment, this stranger who wore my daughter's face, and then I turned and walked away. 6 months passed before I heard from Maya again. Not directly, but through a letter delivered by her attorney. She'd completed her financial counseling program and was making monthly restitution payments as required by her probation. The letter was a formal apology, written in the careful language of someone who'd been coached by lawyers and therapists on how to take responsibility for wrongdoing. I read it once and filed it away without responding. Words on paper couldn't undo the damage she'd caused or restore what we'd lost. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, no matter how sincere the apology might be. What surprised me was how well I was doing without her. The grief I'd expected never fully materialized. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if I'd been released from an obligation I hadn't realized was weighing me down. For years, I'd structured my life around being Maya's mother, making myself available for her needs, prioritizing her happiness. Now, for the first time in over 4 decades, I could focus entirely on myself. I started volunteering at the county senior center, teaching literature classes to other retirees. The work was fulfilling in a way my previous volunteer activities had never been. These were people who shared my love of books and had time to discuss them thoughtfully. We read everything from classic novels to contemporary memoirs, spending hours debating themes and characters and the human truths that great writing revealed. Through the senior center, I met Dorothy, a widow in her 70s who'd lost her husband the same year I'd lost Robert. We bonded over our shared experience of grief and the strange adjustment of living alone after decades of marriage. Dorothy had a sharp wit and a refusal to let age define her limitations. She took ballroom dancing classes, traveled extensively, and maintained a vegetable garden that produced enough food to supply half the neighborhood. We became close friends, the kind of friendship I'd never quite managed to build while I was focused on being a wife and mother. Dorothy understood that my relationship with Maya was complicated and permanently damaged, and she never pressured me to reconcile or suggested that family bonds should override everything else. She'd had her own falling out with one of her sons years earlier, and she knew that sometimes the healthiest choice was to walk away. One afternoon, Dorothy and I were having tea in my living room when she noticed my grandmother's jewelry displayed in a glass case I'd recently purchased. I decided to treat the pieces as the art they were rather than hiding them away in a box. They deserved to be seen and appreciated, not stored like guilty secrets. Dorothy examined each piece with genuine admiration. "These are extraordinary, Vivian. The craftsmanship is museum quality." I told her the story behind each one, about Eleanor wearing the sapphire necklace throughout her life, about my mother's pearl earrings, about Aunt Violet's ruby bracelet and her career in silent films. Dorothy listened with the attention these stories deserved, understanding that the jewelry's value lay not in dollars, but in the connections they represented to women I'd loved and lost. "Have you thought about what will happen to them eventually?" Dorothy asked carefully. "I know you have that trust set up, but with things being complicated with Maya, have you considered other options?" The question made me uncomfortable because I'd been avoiding thinking about it. The trust protected the jewelry from being sold, but it still passed everything to Maya after my death. The idea of these pieces ending up in her possession, even with restrictions on selling them, felt wrong. She'd already proven she saw them as commodities rather than heritage. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call from the curator of our city's historical museum. Her name was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and she'd heard about my jewelry collection through a mutual acquaintance. She was calling to ask if I'd be interested in discussing a possible donation to the museum's permanent collection. "We have a small but growing collection of historical jewelry and accessories," Dr. Walsh explained. "Pieces that tell the story of women's lives across different eras. Your grandmother's Parisian necklace would fit beautifully into our post-war exhibit, and the ruby bracelet would be perfect for our section on women in early Hollywood. These pieces have historical significance beyond their family value." The idea appealed to me immediately. In a museum, the jewelry would be preserved professionally, displayed for the public to appreciate, and connected to the broader story of women's history. They'd be protected forever from anyone trying to sell them for quick cash. Future generations could see them and learn about the women who'd worn them. "I'm very interested," I told Dr. Walsh, "but I'd want certain conditions." The pieces would need to be displayed together as a collection with information about the women they belonged to. Eleanor, my mother Catherine, Aunt Violet. Their stories matter as much as the jewelry itself. Dr. Walsh agreed enthusiastically. We arranged a meeting to discuss the details, and over the next several months we worked out an agreement. I would donate the jewelry to the museum with specific display requirements, and the stipulation that the collection remain intact and never be sold or transferred. In exchange, the museum would create a permanent exhibit about 3 generations of women in my family, with photographs, biographical information, and the jewelry as the centerpiece. The day I signed the donation papers, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The jewelry would be safe, appreciated, and connected to the stories that gave it meaning. No one could steal it, sell it, or use it to pay gambling debts. Eleanor, Catherine, and Violet would be remembered not just by me, but by everyone who visited the museum and learned about their lives. Charlotte helped me update my will to reflect the donation. With the jewelry no longer part of my estate, my financial assets would be divided between several charities I'd come to support during my volunteer work. Organizations that fought elder abuse, provided legal assistance to seniors, and supported women rebuilding their lives after betrayal. My money would do good in the world rather than enabling someone else's destructive choices. I didn't tell Maya about the donation until after it was completed. She had no legal right to object since the jewelry had always been mine to dispose of as I chose, but I knew she'd be upset. Sure enough, when she learned through her attorney that I'd given away what she'd once tried to steal, she sent another letter, this one less apologetic and more accusatory. She claimed I was punishing her, that I was being vindictive by giving away her inheritance, that she'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to be cut out of my life so completely. The letter revealed that she still didn't understand what she'd done, or why it was unforgivable. She saw herself as the victim of my unwillingness to overlook one bad decision during a difficult time in her life. I didn't respond to that letter either. There was nothing left to say. Maya and I existed in fundamentally different realities. In hers, she'd made an understandable mistake during a financial crisis, and I was being unreasonably harsh. In mine, she'd systematically betrayed my trust, stolen from me repeatedly, and then tried to have me declared incompetent to cover up her crimes. No amount of explanation would bridge that gap. The museum held an opening reception for the new exhibit on a warm evening in late spring. The jewelry was displayed in a beautiful case with professional lighting that made each piece glow. Beside the display were enlarged photographs of Eleanor, Catherine, and Violet, along with text panels describing their lives and the historical context of each piece. Dorothy attended with me, along with Charlotte and several friends from the senior center. We stood together looking at my grandmother's sapphire necklace behind its protective glass, and I felt a profound sense of peace. This was where these pieces belonged, honored and protected and connected to the women who'd worn them. They'd survived one more generation and found a home where they'd survive many more. Dr. Walsh gave a short speech about the importance of preserving women's history and thanked me for my generosity. Several visitors approached me afterward to share their own stories about family heirlooms and the complicated emotions surrounding inheritance and legacy. It was clear that many people struggled with similar questions about how to honor the past while protecting against uncertain futures. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey I'd taken over the past year. From the moment I discovered my jewelry at auction to this evening celebrating its permanent preservation, I transformed from a trusting, somewhat naive woman into someone stronger and more self-sufficient. The transformation hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary. Maya had taken something from me, but not what she'd intended. She'd taken my illusions about family loyalty and unconditional love, my assumptions about who I could trust and who would protect me. In return, I'd gained clarity about my own strength and the freedom to build a life around my own values, rather than my relationships to others. I still thought about her sometimes, wondering how she was managing her probation requirements and whether she'd truly learned anything from the experience. But those thoughts came less frequently as time passed, replaced by focus on my own projects and interests and friendships. A year after the museum exhibit opened, I received a notification from Maya's probation officer. She'd completed all her requirements successfully and was petitioning to have her record cleared as allowed under the plea agreement. Did I have any objection to the court granting her petition? I considered the question carefully. Maya had paid her restitution, completed her programs, and apparently stayed out of further trouble. The legal system had imposed consequences and she'd met them. Whether she'd actually changed as a person or just learned to follow rules to avoid harsher punishment, I'd never know. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I told the probation officer I had no objection. Maya had earned the right to move forward with her life, and I'd earned the right to move forward with mine. Our paths no longer intersected, and that was exactly as it should be. On what would have been my 69th birthday, the birthday Maya had supposedly been planning to celebrate by restoring my jewelry, I visited the museum exhibit alone. I stood in front of Eleanor's sapphire necklace and thought about the strength she'd promised was in our family's blood. She'd been right about that strength, even if she couldn't have imagined the circumstances under which I'd need to discover it. The jewelry glittered under the museum lights, beautiful and safe, and connected to stories that mattered. Visitors passed by, reading the placards, admiring the craftsmanship, learning about 3 generations of women who'd loved and worn these pieces. This was their legacy now, and it was better than anything I could have imagined when I'd first handed that velvet box to my daughter. I left the museum and drove to Dorothy's house, where she'd organized a small birthday dinner with friends from the senior center. We ate good food, drank wine, and laughed about the absurdities of aging and the unexpected pleasures of life after letting go of expectations. It was, I realized, one of the happiest birthdays I'd had in years. That night, I returned to my quiet house and felt only contentment. The jewelry was safe. My money would support causes I believed in. I had friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. And I'd learned the most important lesson of my later years, that sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is recognizing when a relationship has become toxic and having the courage to walk away. Eleanor's strength had carried me through, and it would carry me through whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.